Oh, hello. Welcome back. I'm Professor Thomas Pichel. You can just call me Professor Pichel. And this is my lecture on John Updike's A and P. My lecture title is Fiddle de Doo, My Place in the Slot. Okay, let's get right into this. First of all, I'm just going to give a quick run through of the plot, the action of the story. Notice also, you might want to take note that this story is broken in half by an asterisk. So the structure, maybe in one of your analyses, you might want to pay attention to the structure and what's the difference between the before and after. It almost seems like the before the asterisk, it's a lot of setup, a lot of introduction to characters, a lot of what we would call exposition, and then after the asterisk, we actually have the confrontation. So it seems like a very simple story at first look. A and P by John Updike. What we have here is a 19-year-old cashier in a grocery store. A&P is a chain. I'm not sure if they're still in existence, but it was for Atlantic and Pacific, and they thought that it was eventually going to reach the West Coast, but it never did. And Sammy plays with the title A&P a little bit in the story when he says, what's his term? We get a little Cold War sensitivity. He calls it the Great Alexandrov and Petrushki Tea Company. That's what he says it will be in the year 1990. This story came out in, I think, 62. So little Cold War paranoia and humor there. Thought the Russians were going to have us taken over by then. And it's interesting that they mention that because capitalism is a sort of a big um, theme, maybe in the story, or at least a motif. Right? We get lots of that as it goes on. But what happens is Sammy and his coworker Stokes, who goes by Stokesy, are having sort of a boring day in the NP. Lots of middle class families in there shopping, mostly moms and kids and old people. Now, what what happens is, and it's the first line of the sentence, in they walk, right? These three girls, as Sammy describes them, walk in, and it sounds like they're wearing bikinis. We know one is. One is wearing a two-piece. I think that it sounds like they probably all are wearing two pieces. At least one is. And they walk in and they kind of walk around the store and they disrupt the atmosphere. First of all, the cashiers, Stokes is 22, and he and Sammy notice these three attractive young women coming in, scantily dressed, barefoot, and it catches their attention, and they're having a hard time concentrating on work. And Sammy is ringing up a woman who he describes as a register watcher, right? And she gets her kicks out of catching people screwing up. And Sammy rings up her hi ho crackers two times and she kind of flips out. And this is a little reveal about Sammy's character, too. His narrative, you got to hang with it. It's misogynistic at times. It's very critical of sort of middle class white America, but it comes out subtly and with a lot of humor. In fact, he says about the cash register watcher that if she'd been born at the right time, they would have burned her over in Salem. Remember, this story takes place in New England uh, around late 50s, early 60s, so a time of change. Well, anyway, the girls come in, they're walking around the store, and an interesting notation is that they walk against the flow of shoppers. Now, Sammy notes we don't have one-way signs or anything like that, but most people kind of walk through the market like zombies, going in the same direction, and they just sort of follow the people in front of them with their baskets. And he refers to the shoppers more of Sammy's ideas about the world as livestock, as pigs, as sheep, right? As they're going through, and these girls are very different. Okay, he infers that they're probably from upper class society because they buy um, herrings and sour cream. Something that maybe has fallen out of favor, or it's more of an East Coast thing. I don't know. I've never had it. But they're buying this sort of novelty item, this special food item, and they have to walk around the store and look at it. They ask the butcher where it is, and he gives them advice. And everything's going okay. Eventually, they show up into Sammy's checkout line, and he is checking them out in more ways than one. And suddenly, the manager, Langle, walks in. And what happens is Langle confronts the girls, tells them that they're not dressed appropriately for coming into A&P grocery store, and that next time they won't be allowed in if they don't dress appropriately. The leader of the girls, who Sammy characterizes as Queenie, sort of stands up to Langle a little bit, but he pretty much cuts her off. It's at this time that Sammy decides to quit his job. Notice the time sequence here, though. The girls walk out while Sammy's standing there thinking with Langle, and he turns to Langle and says, "I quit." Okay. Um, this is this is if you imagine being 19 years old, and we get the idea that Sammy still lives at home. In fact, Langle threatens to tell his parents, right, and says he'll regret it for the rest of his life, or he'll feel it for the rest of his life. Well, we can debate about those things, but Sammy responds with the nonsense fiddle de doo, something his grandmother said, which is interesting to us because that's a skipped generation, right? Sammy would probably think of his parents as being squares, maybe we could say, but there's something about grandparents that's always cool, right? So he goes two generations back to his grandma, and then he stays with his decision to quit, takes off his apron and his bow tie, and kind of throws them on the counter and comments that it's a good thing it's summer because if it was winter in New England, he'd have to uh, put on his galoshes and his coat and all these things that they do in that part of the U.S. Right, to deal with the harsh winter weather. Yes, harsh winter weathers. Okay. After that, he walks outside and the girls are gone, and he wonders about, I guess, the outcome of his choice. He says that life is going to be hard from now on. He knows that. I also like you to know, harkening back to the title of this lecture, Fiddle de Doo, My Place in the Slot, he looks back in and Langle is standing in there, looking like he's had an injection of iron into his back, standing at the register. Uh, so that's pretty much what happens. Sammy gets outside, the girls are gone, and he's wondering, what he did and how it's going to affect him. It seems that he was hoping that the girls would be there to thank him or praise him for his chivalry or heroism, but they are gone, and they didn't even see him stand up to Langle. So it makes us wonder about the value of doing acts, even with good intentions for people, even if they don't even know that the agent did something, the person did something for them. Okay, so that's pretty much what happens in the story. Uh, I would say for themes, obviously societal unrest. Remember, themes are those ideas or concepts that a story is about. Uh, uh, Societal change, changing times, um, societal restrictions or mores. These are all possible themes. Youth versus age, certainly. These young women are young. Sammy is young. Most of the shoppers are older, married, and Langle certainly is older. Even Stokesy, who's only 22, already has two kids, and thinks that he's probably going to be working at A&P for a long time. Okay, well, let's see. I already said this is a first person narrative. And I think that in spite of some of Sammy's vivid descriptions and biting criticisms of society, he is what we would call a credible narrator. I mean, we don't have any reason to doubt what he's telling us. We do have to realize that we're getting some of his, uh, I guess, spin on some of these things that he highlights for us in his narrative. But he is the character that we are with through this story, and he's also our main character. We could call him the protagonist, right? In this case, you might want to say that the antagonist is the establishment, it's society. And another possible theme that is a popular theme going all the way back to Aristotle is the individual versus the establishment, or the individual versus society. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about dominant imagery and symbolism. All right. Dominant imagery throughout this story is all establishment, all middle class, U.S., working class, capitalism, commercialism. It's all here, even religion. Even if you look out of the the window of the A&P, as Sammy says, look at what we find there. And this is on page 384. Okay. On 384, we get a description of the street. As I say, we're right in the middle of town. And if you stand at our front doors, you can see two banks and the Congregational Church and the newspaper store and three real estate offices and about 27 old freeloaders tearing up Central Street because the sewer broke again. It's not as if we're on the Cape. We're north of Boston, and there's people in this town haven't seen the ocean for 20 years. So look at what we have there. We have a church, definite establishment, right? And it's a Congregationalist church, which was originally Puritan, right? That's descended from the Puritans. We have a couple of banks, certainly representing the capitalist establishment uh, in this town and in the U.S. society, right? We also have a newspaper store. Those things have pretty much disappeared now, gotta say. And I was in this small town in the Midwest. God, this was 7 years ago. Okay? And it was one of these small little old towns, had a little downtown, and there was still a newspaper store, and it was open, but it had a sign on it saying going out of business. But when we're talking about newspaper stores, we're talking about an information outlet, right? And newspapers are owned by people. They essentially are a way of controlling information or disseminating information. Okay, so we've got that there as well. And we also have real estate offices, hallmark of the establishment, private property, right? So we've got that. And then we get some more of Sammy's criticism about um, 27 freeloaders standing there ripping the street out or the sewer out or something. And it reminds me of that scene in an old Michael Douglas movie called Falling Down, where he comes upon all these Caltrans workers and they're all just kind of sitting around and they're getting paid tons of money and they're not doing the job for some reason. And this is sort of Sammy's commentary on um, these guys who are fixing the street or working on the sewer system or something like that. And once again, even if it is the sewer, sewers are communal artifices, right? So a community operates on a sewer system. A town, it's kind of like the town's intestines or bowels. So all of these things harken back to that idea of middle class American capitalistic society, right? So you get that throughout the story too. If you look closely, we get catalogs. I'm talking lists of products in the store. We even get some details, like Sammy's talking about toys that come in cellophane packages, and they fall apart as soon as kids take them out to play with them. And if you think about mass-produced goods, whatever they are, um, historically they have not been as high quality as things that are made. Um, Singly by artisans. Okay, and that's a big difference. Mass production, another hallmark of capitalism. Okay, so let's see. we have appeals to family in here, right? Which Sammy is very critical of. Sammy refers to as a woman in the parking lot as a quote married, right? He's using an adjective as a noun, saying there was a young married in the parking lot with a blue station wagon yelling at her kids, that kind of thing. There's also the people in the store are referred to as house slaves, right? These are probably middle class housewives mostly who take care of kids and take care of the house while their husbands at work. Notice we don't see, um, I don't think we see any fathers or husbands in this story, even though we know that they're out there somewhere, right? And in fact, on an interesting note on that, one of the things that critics talk about in Western civilization is the notion of patriarchy, right? All these things are patriarchal. All this, the property owning, the capitalism, the church, real estate. These are all parts of the patriarchy. Notice that when Queenie is pressed by Langle, she appeals to her mother. She says her mother wanted us to get these snacks, right? So just kind of an interesting little detail if you want to go down that road at all. Uh, so so we get lots of that kind of establishment imagery, is what I would call it throughout, with lots of things that are representative and possibly symbolic of symbolic significance. Certainly, Sammy's designations of, say, the shoppers as pigs and sheep and as house slaves. This is metaphoric, right? But it reveals a lot about what these people are like to Sammy and their behavior. When he talks about the one, we don't have one-way signs. It kind of reminded me of IKEA. I don't know if you've ever been to IKEA, but they sort of herd you through this maze in one way, and you got to grab what you can as you go by it. I mean, it's sort of like the A&P taken to its most radical form, right? So anyway, and IKEA is yes another massive mass-produced selling place, right? But I used to love my IKEA desk that I got from there. Okay, so let's talk about the characters a little bit. Sammy, 19-year-old, obviously very smart, very observant to detail, and critical. So not only does Sammy record and tell, but he also kind of gives his analysis on things, and his analysis is often pretty harsh, pretty severe, maybe you would say, but it is detailed and it's often funny, quite frankly. Um, so I would say that Sammy is really the center of this story, right? So you kind of have to decide: has he had a real change by the end of the story? Has something in him opened up or developed? He's had an epiphany. It certainly seems so. And if you want to go that route, he is a round character. In fact, I won't even discuss stock or flat with Sammy. Now, just about everybody else in here is either flat or stock. Stokes, um, he's either flat or stock. You can make an argument he is static. We know he's not going to change. When Sammy tells us he's going to hope to work there for the next 30 years and become manager, there ain't no development going on right there, right? So we could say that he's sort of the good um, house husband, father, that kind of thing, responsible, working at this job and supporting his family, which we probably couldn't do working at a grocery store as a clerk in these times. But anyway, so that's Stokes. Um, I talked about Sammy a little, and Stokes is only 22. He's only 3 years older than Sammy, so they're kind of like buddies, really. Although once somebody crosses that line, it's kind of hard to relate to them anymore, which is what we find in this situation. Other characters that I'll mention, the girls. Now, this is one of those kind of tough issues as well, because uh, they're definitely not round. Just their place in the story. There's no big changes with them. They're not developing. They're almost sort of like the central plot device. They're the center of the conflict and the action. I would say stock but maybe even more lean towards flat because their one defining characteristic is that they're girls in bikinis entering into a grocery store and sort of disrupting society. You could make the argument that they're stock, like I guess you could say wealthy teenage girls who um, don't feel bound by the rules and the mores of establishment society. Okay. Let's see. Who else do we have? And he does break them down into green plaid, the tall one with black hair. He calls her Big Tall Goonie Goonie. I mean, these are not flattering names. And he calls their leader, who's the one who primarily confronts Langle, and she's the one buying the kipper snacks. Did I say herring before? Herring snacks? Herring snacks, that's what they are. In sour cream. Uh, that he calls her Queenie and sees her as sort of like the leader. Okay. More arguments for them being stock is they almost seem like characters out of classical literature, Greek or Roman literature, Three Muses, perhaps, or Three Graces. I mean, there's plenty of archetypal characters who are kind of like that, and they would be stock in that case if you decide that that's how you see them. I already talked about Sammy, first person credible, right? We get the detailed narration and critique. Oh, I didn't talk about Langle. Langle is kind of a central character here. He is the manager. He sounds like a real square from what Sammy describes. You get the feeling that he's very straight laced, buttoned down. I could just imagine him wearing like a short sleeve Oxford dress shirt with button down collar and maybe a and P tie or something like that, right? And his apron. He's also, in addition to being manager of this grocery store chain, this franchise of this grocery store chain, Langle is also the local Sunday school teacher, right? So we have two more, once again, two more establishment type things. We've got church again, and we've got a corporate grocery store that he represents. And notice also when Sammy talks back to him, or when Sammy decides to quit, what does Langle appeal to? Your parents, right? He says, your parents are going to hear about this, and it's going to affect you for the rest of your life, sort of thing. And whether that's true or not, perhaps this is why Sammy cleaves to his grandmother, who he probably had a very different relationship with than his parents. Now, back to Lango for a second. So we've got corporate capitalism, we've got family. I'm talking atomic nuclear family, right? And we have church. Three very strong uh, establishment icons, right, of the West. So, so Langle is completely stock, right? He is the uptight manager. He is not going to change. He is set in his ways. He's stuck in this job, and he probably doesn't even think of it as being stuck in the job. He's probably very well content with what he gets out of life. So, some questions that we might ask. You know, obviously, this is about social mores or about the individual versus the establishment, youth versus age, those types of themes that I mentioned at the beginning. But some other things that you might consider um, are the end act. A lot of debate goes on about Sammy's rebellion, if you want to call it that. Um, was it worthwhile? Was it chivalrous? Even if the girls didn't know that he stood up for them, was he doing the right thing? Was it foolish? And he's just sort of this hot-headed kid who thinks he's got something to prove, but really he's irresponsible, flaky, as one person wrote on the discussion boards, right? All of these things, we have to question this. I think that that last act is ambiguous. It doesn't seem like it really did. It didn't do anything for the girls. It certainly disrupted the A and P, the environment there, and the working order. And also, it's going to affect Sammy. He lives in a small town. It's probably going to be difficult for him to get another job for a while. His parents are going to be critical, right? He talks about wearing that iron shirt that his mom pressed the night before, right? All these things, all this connection to family. So these are things, some things you want to consider. Was that act just foolhardy and irresponsible, or did he really do a good thing, even though the people that he was trying to do it for didn't even know? Uh, just Also kind of interesting in Sammy's narrative is that these are just the last couple of things in his narrative, is that when he looks at the three girls, he refers to them as poor kids. And this is right before those asterisk breaks, right? And he says, I began to feel sorry for them. They couldn't help it, right? And it's kind of like, I think that that imbues those three girls with an innocence that maybe you could miss in the story. You know, they just didn't give it much thought. They're probably coming from the beach. They had to pick something up for their mom. They stop in and they get into some trouble, right? uh, just by their appearance and by the way they look. So, so those are some other things to think about. Um, Girls, right? Uh, let's see, and I think that that's about it. Those are some good things. You want to take a look. Oh, there was one. Oh, the last thing, Fiddle de Doo. Uh, this is kind of interesting on sort of that language play aspect of the characteristics of literature, right? It's one of the first ones, the primacy of language. And at this ordered, organized, controlled, managed society, what does Sammy respond? He responds with nonsense. And the nonsense is intended to be dismissive, right? You can't understand it. You can't really argue with nonsense. So his fiddle de doo that he got from his grandmother is maybe more powerful than you think, and maybe a way of critique that we don't fully understand, right? And for use in situations where no logical argument is going to save you. Fiddle de doo. And when he leaves, he sees Langle in his place in the slot, right? Which gives us this idea that people in these types of jobs, in some ways, are sort of like pegs in slots, right? Or coins in slots. He even compares to pinball, right? The shoppers being like pinball. Uh, so pay attention to his narrative. Uh, why should this story be relevant to us today? Something to think about. And remember, Cougars, fiddle